am most anxious to enlist everyone who can speak or write to join in checking this mad wicked folly of women's rights, with all its attendant horrors, on which her poor feeble sex is bent, forgetting every sense of womanly feelings and propriety. Feminists ought to get a good whipping. Were women to unsex themselves by claiming equality with men, they would become the most hateful, heathen, and disgusting of beings, and would surely perish without male protection. Queen Victoria.
If your living memory goes back 3 or 4 decades or more like mine does, you don't need me to tell you that there's been a very unmistakable shift in the tone of our political discourse, and indeed in the tone of the news coverage that largely determines the contents of said discourse. The news used to be, generally speaking, a relatively sober affair, a dispassionate proceeding delivered in the dulcet, monotonous, vaguely reassuring tones of the older gray-haired gentleman who sat in the anchor's chair, who had his wife and kids and a nice steak dinner and a brandy to go home to after work. And when he tossed it to a live reporter on the scene of some emergent news event, the reporter was probably just about the same guy as the actor, maybe 12 or 15 years younger. If there was any female presence on the newscast, it would be maybe a hot weather girl or a spunky young correspondent working the consumer affairs beat. And by means of comparison, what do you get with today's news? Well, generally speaking, today's news is a relatively hysterical affair, an aggressively passionate proceeding, delivered in the screeching, wailing, pleading tones of the deeply unhappy single woman in her mid-30s who sits in the anchor's chair, who takes half a dozen mood-equalizing drugs each day, not counting vodka. And when she tosses it to a live reporter on the scene of some mostly peaceful orgy of looting and arson, the reporter is probably just about the same chick the anchor is, but maybe 5 years younger with slightly bigger boobs and twice as unhappy. If there's any sort of male presence on the newscast, it's either an Ivy League professor with a gigantic afro who really hates white people, or a flamboyant homosexual who really hates white people. So where am I going with all this? Well, if you're going to put me on the spot, here it is. Women's suffrage has ruined fucking everything, and I've got the receipts. It is Wednesday, the 9th of July. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where you can't downvote this video unless you own an estate worth at least 40 shillings. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about radical social experiments. For the idea of democracy, the way we define the term in our modern conception, it only originated around 450 years ago over in the Netherlands, and for the first 350 of those years, the idea of universal suffrage would have been totally inconceivable to even the most liberal, most democracy-minded political philosopher. It was a concept that simply did not exist. The founding documents of our American Republic are totally silent on whom should have the franchise. In fact, the first federal act that deals directly with voting rights doesn't happen until the 15th Amendment in 1870. Up until then, the federal government took the view that was laid down in the Constitution, that each state shall be the sole determiner of who gets to vote in that state and what the eligibility rules are. In other words, it's none of our business up here in Washington how you all run your elections out in the several states. Just let us know what the results were. Now, before and during the Revolution and during the Articles of Confederation period, the 13 states had a wide variety of voting eligibility rules, which were often rather wildly dissimilar from one another. You didn't even necessarily have to be a white male in some places. Some states did explicitly bar women and blacks or one or the other from exercising the franchise, but others didn't have any such prohibition. So if a woman or a black guy happened to satisfy the property ownership requirement and the religious test, if there was one in that state, they could just as well vote as anybody else could. So while most people probably wouldn't imagine that women and blacks voted in the very first presidential election in 1788, they totally did. Which would probably come as a real shock to Whoopi Goldberg, who proclaimed on The View just last week that no black Americans were allowed to vote until the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Yes, she really said that. I couldn't make that up. My imagination is not that fanciful. And yes, people are often surprised also to hear that 7 of the original 13 states did have a state religion, and some of those imposed a religious test for voting eligibility. In fact, there is nothing in the Constitution anywhere that says states can't have a state religion. All it says is that Congress can't establish a national religion. But the status quo of 1788 doesn't last very long, for in 1790, Congress passes the Naturalization Act, which, while it doesn't deal explicitly with voting rights, it does restrict U.S. citizenship to free white persons of good moral character. So it does, obviously, have an indirect effect upon voting eligibility. But the property ownership requirements that predate the Revolution, those still exist for that first election of 1788, and every single state has one, and they are often quite weirdly specific. So you want to hear all 13? Yeah, I think you do. In Connecticut, you need an estate worth 40 shillings annually or 40 pounds of personal property. In Delaware, you need 50 acres of land. 12 of them must be under cultivation or 40 pounds of personal property. In Georgia, you just need 50 acres of land. In Maryland, you need 50 acres of land and 40 pounds in personal property. In Massachusetts, you have to have an estate worth 40 shillings annually or 40 pounds of personal property. New Hampshire, you need 50 pounds of personal property. New Jersey, you need 100 acres of land or real estate or personal property worth 50 pounds. New York, you need 40 pounds of personal property or ownership of land. North Carolina, 50 acres of land. Pennsylvania, 50 acres of land or 50 pounds of personal property. Rhode Island and Providence Plantation, personal property worth 40 pounds or yielding 50 shillings annually. South Carolina, 100 acres of land on which taxes are paid, or a townhouse or lot worth 60 pounds on which taxes are paid, or payment of 10 shillings in taxes. Virginia, 50 acres of vacant land, 25 acres of cultivated land, and a house 12 feet by 12 feet, or a townhouse lot and a house 12 feet by 12 feet. You got all that? Because there will be a quiz. But then an interesting thing happens in the 1790s. All the states, one by one, they start dropping those property requirements. There was no federal law or policy that said they had to do that. They just started doing it, in the apparent belief that if we are supposed to be the world's shining example of democratic self-government, then it's probably not the best look when only 5% of the population in our state is eligible to vote in the elections, so maybe let's change that. Nobody forced them to do the right thing, they just did the right thing. It's almost as if the arc of American history really does bend toward justice. Imagine that. And for the next 3/4 of a century, until the end of the Civil War of dastardly Yankee aggression for our rebel viewers, there is something close to an equilibrium that exists during that time. The people who are allowed to vote in the United States are, generally speaking, white male adults of good moral character, meaning, as a practical matter, that you don't have any criminal convictions. And while the property requirements had all gone away, as a practical matter, some states still had a backdoor property requirement in the form of a poll tax. And poll taxes weren't officially outlawed, believe it or not, until the 24th Amendment in 1964. As far as the idea of letting women vote, that idea didn't even originate in this country. It originated in Britain in the latter decades of the 19th century, and it took just about 50 years before it was enshrined in law in 1921, even though the idea had broad public support long before then. So what made it take so damn long? It took so damn long because the staunchest opponent of female enfranchisement was the grandmother of Europe, Her Britannic Majesty, Queen Victoria herself. She thought letting women vote was just about the stupidest idea in the history of the world. And it also reminds me of what Margaret Thatcher said when she was asked whom she wanted in her cabinet. She said only 2 words: no women. And if you're looking for a good explanation of the downside of heavily involving women in politics, you don't need any man to tell it to you, because Queen Victoria and Lady Thatcher both wrote very extensively and very forcefully on that issue. The Queen, in particular, spent many hours each day committing her thoughts to paper. Her diaries wound up being published in 16 volumes of a total of around 2 million words. And that's after her daughter and editor, Princess Beatrice, burned all the pages that were deemed to be too embarrassing or problematic. So she wrote very extensively for a period of many years on why she thought women's suffrage was a bad, terrible, horrible idea. And she didn't confine those thoughts to her diary either. She told her ministers exactly what she thought about it too. She said, if we do this, our politics will become totally gynocentric and emotional and irrational, because every election will be about persuading female voters who are, by their nature, more easily persuadable. In fact, she was so adamant about the whole thing, so trenchantly opposed to it, that it was eventually decided to just drop the issue until after her death, because if we pass the bill while she's alive, there's no chance in hell she is going to give it the royal assent that it requires in order to become law. And that delay happens over here in the States as well, where the women's suffrage movement had arrived from England by that time by way of cultural osmosis, and so both countries wind up giving the vote to women during the exact same 6-month period during 1920 and 21. And again, that's only the second time the United States has made any law directly relating to voter eligibility. The third one is the aforementioned abolition of the poll tax in 1964, and the fourth and final one so far is the extension of the franchise to 18 to 20-year-olds by the 26th Amendment in 1971. So it's not until 54 years ago when we arrive at what we now think of as universal suffrage, and it's only 105 years since we gave women the franchise. It's not my purpose here to say that that was a good thing or a bad thing. Like most other things in history, it is not something that really permits of such a simple binary judgment. My purpose here is to remind us that these things are still experiments, very recent experiments, in fact, and we ought to remain mindful of that. We ought to be able to discuss it without anybody flipping out and screaming nonsense noises at the sky, because it is an inarguable fact, I would submit, that our politics and government have been drastically changed by that enfranchisement, because it's that enfranchisement that opens the door to the political environment that exists today, which is effectively the same environment that Queen Victoria predicted around 130 years ago. Our discourse has become wildly gynocentric. Our news coverage has largely devolved into an exercise in spuriously appealing to female emotions. Our political parties do fight harder for female votes than they do for any other demographic. In just the last half century, my own lifetime, we've gone from almost exclusively male elected officials to a world where it's pretty much 50-50. That extends to the press corps, too, and it's an even bigger phenomenon there, because the last time you heard the White House press corps shouting questions at the president, what did you hear? You heard a cacophony of almost exclusively young female voices. In some state university systems, 75% of incoming freshmen are now females. Those are very, very drastic changes whose ramifications will redound right through the ages, and all of which are a direct result of giving women the franchise a century ago. But we tend to just sort of act like universal suffrage is the way things are supposed to be, and who knows, maybe that's true, but it benefits absolutely no one, and certainly not the country or the world at large. When we preclude ourselves from talking realistically about the social experiments that we are actively engaged in. I am done, that's all I've got. See you next time. Get off my lawn.